In your head. I think I have that on here. Hey there, Mama Bear. Waiting for this thing to get started. Not yet, not yet. Let me see if I can find. It should be right here. Yeah, we can watch this.
I'm John Reddick. I've been with Norfolk Southern for 13 years. Most of that as a conductor and an engineer.
This is the commercial that
with the hazmat department. So I've been with East Palestine Fire Department for 22 years. Started as a firefighter EMT.
While we're waiting for
later promoted to lieutenant, and now serve as a captain with the fire department.
He was actually working when the derailment happened. So as soon as he was able to get off of the train and get over there, came over and was an instrumental part of our team.
Norfolk Southern was really good, giving me time to help support my local fire department while that specific incident was going on. But I'm full-time with Norfolk Southern right now. I'm pretty passionate about training, so just pushing that training out into the communities and our first responder community to give them the knowledge that they need to know so that they can pass it on to us as we're responding. Because again, they're going to be the first ones there, and they're giving us the heads up of what we're getting into when we get there.
He's been a huge asset to our department, and I'm sure he's going to be just as big as asset to Norfolk hazmat team.
I've loved my time at East Palestine Fire Department, and I certainly won't be going anywhere where I would have to change that. I'm rooted in East Palestine and plan on staying in East Palestine.
Oh, don't these guys realize these are the bad guys? They poisoned the town. I don't think anything else interesting I can show you guys. I'll take a look at this. Oh, TNT, we'll get you fixed up. Don't worry. You didn't get your radiator, or do you call it a radiator where you're from? Did you get it yet? Let me check, make sure this thing started yet. Oh, not yet. You're halfway there with getting the radiator, or are you halfway there with getting it installed? Because would you say they were going to charge you $150 for install? Hey, Vaughn Michelle, I haven't seen you for a long time. I'm in your videos, but usually I'm driving and I can't really chat. Okay, you need $350 for all of it. Okay. We'll get you hooked up. Oh, look, we might be live. Yeah, Vaughn, I'd drive down there and help you put up fence panels. You're not too far away from me. You only probably half an hour, 45 minutes at most. All right, let's see if this works. Oh. Okay, my volume's on.
The Ohio River Valley Institute. As we continue to wait for more participants to join, I want to cover just a couple of technical notes. The first is that we will record this session for those who are not able to join live. In addition, we've enabled closed captioning for this event for accessibility. I'd also like to thank Ben Hunkler, who's the communications manager for the Ohio River Valley Institute, who's coordinated this event and who's on here today in case you have any technical issues with the meeting. So we're going to open this event with a panel discussion, after which we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or chat function, and I will do my best to see that we get through as many questions as we can in the time allotted. If there are any questions that we don't have time to address or can't address for any reason during the event, we will be sure to follow up with people directly.
I'm still here. I'm just disappearing.
So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're very honored to be joined this evening by a really wonderful group. Jamie Nentwick is here with us from River Valley Organizing, an incredible community-led group that has been working more than overtime to support the residents of East Palestine and the broader community in the wake of this derailment and resulting crisis. We're also joined by Nick Messenger, our Ohio-based senior researcher with the Ohio River Valley Institute, who's been providing in-depth research on the situation in East Palestine, as well as into the broader context in which that work is situated. We're also joined by Justin Mikulka, a research fellow at New Consensus and the author of the book Bomb Trains: How Industry Greed and Regulatory Failure Put the Public at Risk. And finally, we're honored to be joined by Pittsburgh City Councilwoman Erica Strasburger, who represents the city's 8th district and has been a longtime advocate for stronger community protections from the transportation of hazardous and other materials by rail. So thank you very much to our panelists for being here. We also invited a number of other elected officials who unfortunately were not able to join us live, but Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio did provide us with a letter that I'd like to read for you all before we open things up to our panel. So Senator Brown says, I want to thank you for taking this much needed step in highlighting the issues and concerns all Ohioans have regarding the transportation of toxic chemicals by rail. I appreciate that you're hosting a session on the importance of rail safety. Rail safety is why I introduced bipartisan legislation with Senator J.D. Vance to make trains safer as they go through communities like East Palestine. We want to do everything in our power to make sure that a devastating accident like the one we've seen in Ohio never happens again. This is why I repeatedly visit East Palestine to listen to first responders, business people, residents, and public officials. The Railway Safety Act of 2023 will improve rail safety protocols, finally standing up to railroad company lobbyists so no other community has to deal with what East Palestine and others in Ohio, including the residents of Springfield, Sandusky, and Steubenville, have experienced. What this bill does is enhancing safety procedures for all trains carrying hazardous materials, preventing wheel-bearing failures, requiring two-person crews, making rail carriers pay for their wrongdoing, supporting communities impacted by rail disasters, investing in the next generation of safety improvements. It shouldn't take a train derailment for elected officials to put partisanship aside and work together for the people we serve, not corporations like Norfolk Southern. Education, as you're doing today, is key. Thank you for your efforts to educate others on this important issue. Sincerely, Senator Sherrod Brown. So again, thank you very much to Senator Brown for sharing this, even though he couldn't join us live. I'd now like to kick off our panel and turn to Jamie with River Valley Organizing. Jamie, could you give us a sense of what's happening on the ground in East Palestine and how River Valley Organizing has stepped up to help the community?
So what's going on in East Palestine is a situation where we have United States citizens that have been lied to and poisoned by a company who has plenty of money to take care of the disaster that they have caused. The EPA has had different outcomes as outcomes that compared to outcomes that we have had. So what we're doing is we are pairing with several organizations to get testing for those who need it. We have boots on the ground in East Palestine. We're canvassing actively. We are working close with 20 researchers to do different testing in depth as far as ground and health testing goes. Folks are still being moved around. They're not able to go back home. And the different places that they have to stay, they're only able to stay for days on end, and then they have to switch over again. They have found vinyl chloride in systems. At the time, they're still being told that everything is safe, and they're still afraid and angry.
Thanks so much. I know that the community has issued a list of demands, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing just some of those asks from the community as the response continues.
I am stepping in right now for Amanda and Daniel. I would have to pull up the list of different specific asks. I don't have the list of specific asks, but I do know that they are wanting fair compensation for the monies that they have lost. A lot of people have lost their jobs. They are looking for truth and honesty. They want the company to tell the truth, and they want everything to be handled properly. We want legislation to change so this doesn't happen in the future for anyone else. And we want to make sure our children are going to be taken care of. We would love to push for healthcare for all for the area because it's going to be hard to tell what ailment is coming from just regular life or from the horrible toxins that have been exposed to all of these residents in East Palestine.
Thank you so much. And sorry for putting you on the spot there. I can.
Oh, no, it's quite all right.
I can go through, I think the 5 major demands, just for reference for the attendees, as I understand them, are relocation for anyone who wants to be relocated, independent environmental testing, ongoing medical testing and monitoring, the disposal of the toxic waste in a more safe way, and that Norfolk Southern pays 100% of the cost, that none of it lands on the taxpayer. So I think exactly what you said, and just for those people who may not have been familiar with the specific community demands, that's the general contour of those 5 pillars. So thank you so much. And so Nick, maybe
thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Nick, maybe I could turn to you now just to give us a summary of your research and what you've been learning as you're kind of digging in on this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Jane, and thanks, Jamie, for sharing. I think it's important to start kind of on the ground with what people are experiencing there, and really drive that point home that as I zoom out and provide some kind of more factual summary and discussion around the incident, that we've got to remember there are real people at the core of this whose daily lives are impacted and continue to be impacted by this. And so just for the background and kind of context, what we're discussing, and I assume everybody here is familiar because they're attending the webinar about it, but on February 3rd, this train essentially derailed. It was about 38 cars, about 20 of them were carrying what the EPA and the government classifies as hazardous material on the 3rd. And what subsequently kind of happened after that derailment was a venting of several of the cars. 5 of them contained a chemical called vinyl chloride, which has really explosive potential. And so essentially Norfolk Southern was like, oh my gosh, we've got to vent these things because we don't want to cause an explosion. So this venting occurred a few days later on February 6th. And this is really where I think residents, everything starts to go kind of wrong in the way that this begins to unfold and is handled, because I think one of the things you really pointed to, Jamie, and one of the things that's really apparent in doing any kind of research, whether that's talking to folks in the region or just reading the news, is that this is now a complete story of lost trust between government and agencies and regulators at all levels, between a company and government, between government and citizens, between citizens and other citizens. I mean, this has kind of spiraled because of a lack of misinformation, a lack of transparency. And actually, the process of going through and researching this was extremely difficult, because it's really hard. And I'm sure, Justin, you can talk to this too. It's actually really hard to dig around and actually find some of this information. And you can find conflicting versions of things, and you can find data that and test results and water tests and air tests that don't align, that are different from each other. You can find different kind of guidances depending on what agencies you go to. And so it's really a ball of yarn that's difficult to untangle. So essentially what happens after this venting of vinyl chloride into the atmosphere, which is a identified carcinogen and linked to cancer, is that it comes to essentially light that this train also contained a lot of other chemicals on board as well. And there became a much larger concern about contaminated water in addition to air. And you had residents begin finding over the week after and days after, you began finding chemical slicks in creeks along the community. You began kind of identifying that you had a much larger problem than just venting these cars of vinyl chloride. And what really followed was the period of huge confusion, because you had the governor of the state, Governor DeWine's office, and the Ohio EPA very quickly come out to say, things are safe, things are good, the drinking water's fine, we've sampled the drinking water. It came to light several weeks after that, in the middle of February, on the 14th and 15th, the governor's office had said, the drinking water's fine. The county health authority said, we haven't tested and gotten our test results back. It came to light, there was quite a few articles that came out that week that highlighted that the only data the Ohio EPA had posted was test result data that was actually commissioned by Norfolk Southern itself, which really digs at an ongoing problem that's, even if you're reading stories about this from March and April now, just this week, Norfolk Southern is playing a pretty large role in this entire process of the cleanup and regulation of the cleanup, which, I think is a little bit kind of jumps out from the research a little bit, kind of like the fox guarding the chicken coop kind of situation going on. And so where things really stand is that Norfolk Southern, despite its initial kind of things are fine, I think I'd offer the town like $25,000 in compensation, which was less than $5 a resident initially. Very quickly kind of launched this public relations campaign around making things right. One of the things that I'll share as an economic researcher and economist is that the cost of making things right is really hard to ascertain, and nobody knows what that cost is. As Jamie mentioned, there are health problems that may not materialize from some of these chemicals for years or decades. There are children who were, reported to have symptoms where parents were taking children to seek medical care for symptoms they didn't have before the incident. And the really scary, terrifying, horrible aspect of all of this is that the cost, and not just in dollar terms, but in human terms, to all of this is really unknown. And so I think that there's a really big gap in trust between the community and Norfolk Southern and the state when folks say, oh, we're going to pay to clean it all up, we're going to take care of it, we're going to make things right. What does that really mean? We saw at the end of February, CNN hosted a town hall, which was really one of the first major national appearances where we saw some residents from the community actually kind of challenge the CEO of Norfolk Southern and say, I was planning to retire. I wanted to sell my house. My house value, it's well documented after these types of events, home values plummet. Can I plant tomatoes in my backyard? Is it okay for my, grandchildren to eat the fruit that we grow in our garden? Small business owners talking about the lost revenue. And so there's all kinds of costs that are not going to become apparent. They're not market costs. They don't have a price tag on them. I do apologize. My dog has decided to lose something under the couch and is digging. But where things really stand today is that, in the weeks after, the response was pretty slow. And what really happened is that you ended up having this barrage of officials visit, right? We saw Pete Buttigieg visit, Secretary Buttigieg visited. We saw Michael Regan from the EPA finally visit. We saw both of Ohio's senators visit. Governor DeWine visited and drank the water and said, oh, look, I'm drinking the water. It's completely fine. And as they started to visit, I think information got actually even more murky, because as you saw these news stories start to appear of what folks were saying in their press conferences, information started to really be conflicting. And the researchers, there's a research team from Carnegie Mellon that has been involved. There's a research rapid response team from Purdue and Notre Dame that have been involved. And one of the things they've really highlighted in a lot of their work is that there's been a lot of safety claims, but a lot of the test results, which I think really digs to the core of what was released from the train and how is it impacting the community, have been really inconsistent. When we've had independent testers, they've found higher concentrations of some things that the EPA hasn't found, that the Norfolk Southern testers haven't found. In some situations, the EPA has found higher concentrations than things the independent testers have found in different locations along the waterways. And so really where things stand is we've got these regulations proposed, and I'm sure Justin will talk a little bit more about the long history of the difficulty in regulating rail in particular in this case. But where things stand now is cleanup is ongoing in the region, and the soil excavation from the tracks finally began, and even that has not gone really that well. The soil has been excavated. It's created a lot of political discussion and debate because if you've moved hazardous material or followed any stories about moving hazardous material, there's very few sites around the country that can take very specific types. And so you have to move it often over state lines. Last week, we saw, the truck carrying the contaminated soil out of East Palestine actually overturned in the county and spilled 20,000 gallons of the contaminated soil back out of the truck into an area that it previously wasn't. And you saw these same types of claims. Oh, it's safe, it's fine, we've cleaned it up, it didn't get into the waterway. But when you have eroded the trust because of so much confusion over a period of multiple months, this information really is hard to get out and hard for people to receive and believe. And I think that really is kind of the nexus of where things stand right now in the community and in the state, which is this massive information has come out. a lot of information and details about how that information was generated, how tests were conducted, where tests were conducted, when tests were conducted, who conducted tests, what are the costs of the event. There are a lot more questions for residents, I think, now than there are answers. And so as we kind of see cleanup continue and be ongoing, we've seen states like Texas and Indiana and Michigan really kind of balk at receiving the contaminated soil, which I think has created a feedback loop in essence, right? Because when you started out in early February with a lot of discussion around how safe things were and how this wasn't as big of a deal as the media was making it, or how it wasn't, we vented, but we didn't contaminate other things. Now, when you have other states saying, well, wait a minute, we don't want the soil from East Palestine, or we don't want, don't ship that here, you're creating more risk. I think folks on the ground are really feeling like, well, wait a minute. So you told us at February 6th and 7th that this was under control. And here we are in April where, Michigan is saying we don't want the soil to come. We weren't alerted that the soil was coming through here. A lot of these cases too, the information, I don't mean to disparage and say state officials are purposefully not sharing information either. I think one thing that really became apparent from my research and discussions is that a lot of the current regulatory environment doesn't require that the state know anything about what Norfolk Southern or the railroads are carrying. And so I think you had a situation, and maybe Councilwoman will speak to this a little bit as well, where the folks who are elected and who are trying their best to actually protect citizens and residents don't have the information from these companies about what the actual risks and actual processes in place are. And so I think that becomes very difficult to regulate an industry when you don't have the transparency from the industry itself about what's on board the train, what are the risks involved, how is the train managed, what is the internal safety regulations in place. There's been a lot of discussion around, was it a fault of national or state regulation, or was it a fault of Norfolk Southern's internal rules and policies about how to handle certain situations? And, in summary, I think the answer is probably all of the above. And so as we've kind of researched out and worked on it, we've kind of continued to follow not just the accident, but the cleanup procedure, and we'll continue to follow the discussion around how the cost in full of this incident will actually be calculated and determined. And the unfortunate part is that I'm not sure that there ever is a final number we can get to that will suddenly make things right when you've disrupted this many lives.
Thanks so much, Nick. I think there are a couple comments in the chat. One, which I think you also touched on, is just that perception also has an economic cost. And again, perception is something that I think is difficult to quantify, even though we can see some of the effects of that cost. And then I don't know, Nick or Jamie or other panelists, if you can speak to this, but there was also a comment about understanding that the consensus agreement was to vent one tank car at first, but then Norfolk Southern decided to vent 5 cars. I don't know if that came up in any of your research, Nick, or Jamie, if you've heard that from people in the community.
I have not heard that from anyone. It does not mean that anybody from my team has not. So that would definitely be a question I could email someone about and get for you.
Yeah, and I think in the course of the research, this kind of just drives home that point, which is, what is the internal policy at Norfolk Southern? How do they communicate that policy with the state? Who has to sign off on them doing that? Do they have unilateral? I mean, there's so many layers to the decision-making in an emergency rapid situation that then you start to have these types of questions, right? Where, well, wait a minute, what really happened? And that kind of drives the issue a little bit more to the transparency around decision-making and the idea that really nobody has taken point on this, right? Nobody is really leading the charge of all of the different, not only the company, but the different state and national agencies involved. And on the point of perception, that's certainly something I've heard in the rest of the state. I'm based in Columbus, where I'm affiliated with Ohio State and as well, and chatted with folks in Cincinnati when Cincinnati Water Works, closed their Ohio River intake. following a plume of one of the chemicals had kind of been tracked down the Ohio River. And again, the testing was, and the EPA said it's fine, don't worry about it. But we saw, both West Virginia and Ohio water facilities and districts actually close their Ohio River intake. I think probably more from perception than anything. But I've certainly heard of folks who say, oh, well, I'm not, I wouldn't drive through there. I wouldn't stop. You're driving through on the highway or nearby. You want to stop and eat at a diner, right? That is actually someone's livelihood who runs a business or a service in the community. And anybody outside is going to look at that community and immediately associate it with these toxic chemicals, these really horrible symptoms of nausea and headaches and nosebleeds that we've seen reports of. One other thing just to note on that is that, the CDC actually sent a team in the end of March to study the effects. And the CDC team actually fell ill and reported it to the CDC. And the CDC said that the team was out for the rest of the afternoon with a lot of the same symptoms that residents have reported. So certainly stories like that, the comment about it being perception and 100% true, that is outside of the community, something that really will linger for a long time. I mean, when we think about the Gulf, right? You still can think about the BP oil spill, or you can still think about these major disasters that occur. And it really can take a long time for a community to recover, even once the science says it is settled and saying that it's okay and it is safe. I think in this case, that's even a further problem, because I'm not sure that the science totally is settled yet on this particular case as well. So I think there's layers of problems here that are ongoing. But yeah, that's a great point.
Thanks so much, Nick. Just on the cost issue, Andrew from the Clean Air Council has made a great point in the chat, which I think only our host and panelists can see some of the chat. So I want to read a few things out as they come in. That the Clean Air Council, for example, can put a dollar amount on the number of indoor air purifiers that they've purchased and distributed and the amount of unfulfilled requests that they have, even though contaminated homes should be a priority for the state agencies in Ohio and the federal EPA and the company, but that responsibility and cost has fallen on organizations like the Clean Air Council. And I think that's a great point, that this is a really good example of how the costs of industrial activity are socialized out to people and organizations rather than often where they should land. So I think with that, Justin, if I could transition to you and just say, you've been working on this issue for a long time. Could you talk about how you see issues of transporting petrochemicals and other hazardous materials by rail, as well as any regulatory or enforcement considerations we should be thinking about?
Sure, thanks. And I also, later on, I want to address that question about the venting of 5 tanks, because I think there's more information on that. But I think the risks are really clear. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the risks. I really want to talk about regulation and enforcement, because that's how we address this. I have been working on this issue basically for 10 years. I and many others got involved in this issue when a train of fracked oil from North Dakota derailed in Lac Mégantic, Quebec in 2013. It ignited, killed 47 people, and burned the downtown, which is, unfortunately, we're almost, the 10-year anniversary is going to be in July. They have not rebuilt yet due to a lot of the issues that I've talked about here already. That train was using tank cars called DOT 111s. And I wasn't a journalist at the time, I was a concerned resident who lived in a town or a city that had a lot of these trains coming through it. So we all were worried about this happening in our city. And so I made a short film about the risks and what we knew at the time. And I opened that talking about how the National Transportation Safety Board had, in the early 1990s, had warned that these DOT 111 tank cars are unsafe and prone to spills and derailments. So the NTSB said that in the early 1990s. Here we were in 2013. But what the other thing that I mentioned there is the NTSB has no enforcement capability. And so that's what we're here talking about. We have regulations, but we have to also be able to enforce them. The NTSB does great work. But unfortunately, they have no ability to stop the rail industry from using these DOT 111s. So some of those tank cars were in the train in East Palestine. So they're still being used. What has happened? What has been the response? Regulators has asked the industry to voluntarily stop using them. So 30 years after we were first told they're unsafe, after we've had several disasters, and we're still asking politely, could you please stop using these? And this is in the book I wrote about this, I referenced another book about the risks of rail called Death Road to Rails. And the author there talked about this, there's a long history of volunteerism, is what he called it, where, even in the 1800s, there'd be a horrible accident, people would die in a rail accident, and you really didn't want to be riding trains in the 1800s. The industry would say, we apologize, safety is our top concern, it's their favorite line, and we promise to do better, but please don't regulate us. And they largely have been able to get away with that. So you can see that here we are, 10 years, all new regulations that were done in response to Lock-McGontic, and the DOT 111 cars were still part of this training, even though they are unsafe and prone to spills and derailments. So the NTSB does great work. They said that this accident in East Palestine was 100% preventable. So the question is, why did it happen? The reason they can confidently say it's 100% preventable is because we know how to prevent these. We know the regulations. There's a wealth of research, decades of research of how we would make transportation of hazardous materials by rail much safer and prevent disasters like what happened in East Palestine. I have a whole chapter in my book that came out 5 years ago saying, here's what we need to do. And so the NTSB knows, the railroad industry knows. I detail that in my book. They know all these technologies, and when it's in their benefit, in their favor, they will argue how they're safer. But now they're saying, their main argument is they don't want to pay for it. But so when my book came out, and I wrote about the problems, the regulatory issues, and the solutions, I got no response from the rail industry. The rail trade publications didn't mention my book, but what they did do, the rail lobbyists in the rail industry, they reported me to the federal security apparatus known as fusion centers as a potential threat to the rail industry. So what I had done was write a book and say, here are the problems, here are solutions. And that got me put on a list of potential, essentially there were like neo-Nazis and other terrorists and me. They had my book speaking tours on there to submit to local public, law enforcement. That's the response. That's who we're dealing with. That's why we cannot rely on them. I would not trust what they say either. Like the people of East Palestine who are asking for the truth. But that's what we're up against when we're looking at regulating this industry. There's been great work done on rail safety since Lock-McGontic. There was a congresswoman from California, Jackie Steiner, who since retired. There was a pipeline incident in her district that killed 8 people, and so she was trying to improve regulations. The regulatory agency that does that for hazardous material transportation is called PHMSA, which is the Pipeline Hazardous Material and Safety Administration. They're the ones who actually write the regulations. At one point, after trying for years to improve safety and fighting the oil industry, which is a very worthy or very good opponent, they know what they're doing and they're very well funded. She declared that the regulatory system for hazmat was fundamentally broken. And at the time, I agreed completely because I had watched this play out after Lock-McGontic. I used to use the term regulatory capture. But what I since have learned, I was talking to someone who worked within one of these agencies regulating the oil industry. I said, we've got regulatory capture that we're dealing with. And she said, this isn't regulatory capture. That assumes that the system isn't working as designed. I was assuming that our regulations were put in place to protect the public. And what she was saying was this system is designed to protect corporations and corporate profits. I have since seen plenty of evidence to support that argument. So yeah, I think we really need to understand that when we think we're 10 years after Lockheed and we're trying to figure out the same questions and answers. How do we stop this from happening again? Our system is broken, or it's not even really designed to do what we are asking it to do. And I just want to close with an example of that. It takes years to get regulations made. After Lockheed, these oil trains kept derailing and blowing up, so there was a lot, and there were huge explosions. So they made the news, and people were saying we need to do something about this. As the regulatory process unfolded, meetings that I and the members of the public could attend, there were always members of, Nick used the phrase fox guarding the hen house. I've used that many times over the years. You would be in a regulatory session that's like, how can we make oil by rail safer? And the person leading the discussion worked for the American Petroleum Institute. The lobbyists are at the table talking about, and they often saying, yeah, we're not willing to do this. And so it was a real education for me about how the process got watered down. They challenge the science, they challenge known solutions, and they're very good at it. So when the regulations came out in 2015, I wrote an article that said this was a big win for the oil and rail industries, but we got one thing that's really going to improve safety. We got modern brakes. They were given 8 years to phase them in, but modern braking systems on hazardous material trains would be a huge improvement. The brakes that were on the train in Lockheed are the same as the ones that are in East Palestine. They're based on technology that was basically come up. They created that in 1860. The rail industry wants us to believe in the time from 1860 until now, there hasn't been a better way to stop trains. That's a lie. There is, and that was the brakes, the ECP brakes that were mandated. About a month after those regulations came out, I was at the EIA conference in Washington, D.C., which is the annual energy industry conference. There were probably 500 people in the opening keynote address. And the keynote speaker was the CEO of BNSF, the largest rail company. They move the most oil by rail at the time. And these trains are still blowing up, so this was a real issue. So the moderator asked him about these regulations. They said, what do you think about them? He said, they're good. We're okay, except for that braking thing. We're going to have to change that. I was still naive at this point. I thought, did he say that publicly? Like, we just went through a years-long process to get new regulations. And the one thing we got, he's saying we're going to change that. And he was right. And he knew that they could use Congress, they could use agencies within the Department of Energy, National Academies of Science, to challenge the known science and say, we don't think these modern brakes improve safety. I have detailed the years of research and comments from rail lobbyists, rail executives, rail regulators, who are all on record saying, these are a huge improvement in safety. The science is clear. The industry just doesn't want to pay for it. And that CEO and the rest of the industry was able to take regulations that everyone fought for and did the right thing. And the one real thing that we were able to get through, they repeated. And so I think that that's really important to understand, because we're having these same conversations now that we had 10 years ago. A wonderful group of activists and organizations all did the right thing, fought for the right thing. And the best we got were watered down regulations that then industry was able to further corrupt. So I think as we think about this, I hope I'm not sitting in one of these sessions 10 years from now having the same conversation. We need to understand the system we're dealing with, challenges. We need to hold our elected officials accountable, and they need to fight when they get, if we are able to get regulations passed, because the way the regulations are watered down is through Congress. That's how it's done. And so we need to make sure if our elected officials, it's more than just proposing bills. You need to follow them for years, and you need to fight. And so that's, I think that's my main message here is that's what we're up against. And so I think we need to be aware of that, and hopefully we're able to be more successful this time around. And we aren't, another community isn't a sacrifice zone down the road. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. And I do see that we're getting some more questions and conversation in the chat. So I'm capturing everything, and we'll make sure that we pull that back into the discussion. But before we do that, Councilwoman Strasburger, I'd love to hear from you as a policymaker. I'm sure it's a very frustrating time to be a policymaker who wants to do the right thing and is in this position. But what do you think could have been done better? How can policy make a difference? And what do you think it will take from decision makers and the public to see real progress? So as Justin says, we're not just back here in 10 years having the same conversation.
Sure. Well, thank you, Joanne, and thanks to everyone for inviting me here this evening. As was mentioned in the introductions, I serve on Pittsburgh City Council, and I have a district, one of 9 districts in Pittsburgh on City Council. So, while I represent about 32,000 people, I do feel as if my responsibility covers, all 300,000 or so residents of the city of Pittsburgh. And of course, Pittsburgh is fully dependent on the county and the region that it's in. So really, what I think about and what I care about and my policy focus extends far beyond the district that I represent. Much like Justin, I first became educated on this issue, on this topic about 10 years ago, after the Quebec train derailment and explosion. And I, that was the time at which I realized frustratingly that if you're a local government official, you have almost next to zero power to regulate or to pass legislation or resolutions to regulate this industry. The power to regulate comes at the federal level. And yet at that point, we saw a lot of collective action coming out of cities. We saw resolutions from New York City to Chicago to Harrisburg to Pittsburgh itself, calling on Congress to pass some of the legislations, the regulations that Justin alluded to. And I think I agree, it was a huge missed opportunity in part because of the power of the railroads and their lobbying and lobbying power, their financial power, and their ability to, through hundreds of years, at least 100 years, if not more, decades and decades of just embedded power in our system and the way it's integrated into the fabric of our government. But I'll divide what I'd like to see in terms of the regulation of this industry into a couple of categories. One is just the safety of the equipment itself. Phasing out the unsafe cars, ensuring that anything traveling by rail, whether it's hazardous and flammable materials, or whether it's people who are traveling by rail, are traveling on tracks that are well maintained and are safe for everyone, for everything. We know that transparency is a big issue as well. Local government officials, let alone emergency responders, don't have the information that we need to be able to understand when a hazard might present itself and when we need to take additional measures. So at the very least, some of the components of the Railway Safety Act 2023 that both the House and the Senate have introduced would help with this, but ensuring that there is greater transparency, if not to the public, if that's deemed to be too insecure for the railroad companies, at the very least, those at the local level and the county, at the county level and the state level should be aware of the pathways and the types of materials that are being carried through these both urban and rural areas. There was the option that was presented as a hazardous material transport fee. And I think that's a really important piece because both, the railroads themselves having the insurance to cover the cost of a derailment, but also actually having the money to be able to pay local governments, in some cases state governments, to be able to cover the cost of something that might happen, or to cover the cost of emergency preparedness. There's only so much that we as cities can do to prepare. If, the city of Pittsburgh, fortunately, we have an emergency preparedness system that I trust. There are other areas that we know that are, smaller boroughs and townships and smaller cities that might have a volunteer police or a volunteer fire department, might have volunteer emergency responders, where there's not as much ability to coordinate. And every one of those localities where where rail lines carry through should have the ability to do planning exercises, to plan for the worst possible scenario to happen. But they can't do that if they don't have the resources, the know-how, and the financial ability to do so. So I'm strongly in favor of a hazardous material transport fee as one of probably multitude of options to help local governments have the resources to prepare. That could also come in the form of technical support. Whether it is a combination of the EPA, the NTSB, whatever federal resources could be brought to bear to provide the technical support to do planning exercises, tabletop exercises, drills, whatever it takes. Because, the unfortunate reality that we saw on the ground in East Palestine is that there just wasn't the coordination that could have prevented the horrific effects of the venting of the gas, the effects to air quality, water quality that we saw, because there just wasn't there wasn't the preparedness there. There were people making decisions that probably shouldn't have been the position making decisions, or at the very least, there should have been some level of I keep saying coordination, but of hierarchy of knowing who to ask to make these decisions, who is the best prepared to make these decisions. So I'm fully in support of the federal bills that are being introduced. I think it's a start. I think that the frustrating reality, though, is that we're told again and again that when it comes to hazardous material, rail is the safest mode of transportation. That if it's carried by a river barge, it has the potential to pollute our waterways. That if it's carried by trucks, that it's far more likely to crash inside of a tunnel, or cause additional harms to people's lives and livelihoods. That if that's the case, we have to do far better with regulating and enforcing the laws that would legitimately keep it as safe as possible. With the sheer number of tank cars that are allowed on these trains, the length of the trains, the few number of staff that are actually working to keep these trains safe, there is just the high likelihood of human error, which if it gets any more likely that there's a small ratio between the number of workers and the number of tank cars, I don't see that this could be any safer than, say, a big rig transporting this on a highway where there's a likelihood of a crash. So we certainly need to make sure that there's a ratio that is safe, that is fair to workers, that this is an industry that would be attracting people who truly care about this work, and that they're paid, that they're remunerated in a fair way, that they have time for sleep, for time off, for being with family, so that they can come to work and really be on their A game in the way that an air traffic controller is, because this is life or death in the same way that that industry is. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we are in this situation in the first place because of our dependence on fossil fuels, right? And so zooming out a little bit, that one of the best ways that we can prevent the likelihood of hazardous and flammable material being transported through urban and rural areas in the first place is to break our dependence on fossil fuels and to promote district energy, renewable energy wherever possible, and to break our reliance on plastic, because just northwest of Pittsburgh here is the Beaver Cracker plant, which not only has exceeded its air pollution levels allowances within the first month of operating, but is producing, the seeds for single-use plastics. So we have to get to the root cause of it, in addition of our, dependence on these substances that are being carried in these trains, as a fundamental step, in addition to, better regulations, better enforcement. Now, to the question of how we make this happen, again, about 10 years ago, I was heartened to see advocacy at the local level from mayors, from city councils, really rising up and making this a priority. And I think what's a real opportunity here is that, I liken it to federally qualified health centers that get funding from the federal government year after year after year, and are almost, one of the most stable forms of federal funding, in part because they exist in urban areas and they exist in rural areas. And the same is true for railroads. Here in Pittsburgh, we're an urban location. We have rail lines carrying hazardous material that are coming right through the heart of our city, and in some cases underneath condo buildings. It's incredibly, we're incredibly in a kind of fragile situation, very vulnerable to this type of terrible tragedy happening and affecting us here. And it would be easy to politicize this if it were only the case in places like Pittsburgh, but it's not. It's rural, it's urban, it cuts across party lines. And I think that really presents us with an opportunity to organize local officials from all walks of life, all parts of the country, and all political parties to come together and demand greater regulation in the way that our federal representatives and senators have started to do. I think there's real power there, and that's the opportunity I see to make a real change once and for all in this regard.
Thank you so much. And really thank you for your leadership on this. It's so important to have engagement at all levels of government. And it's been really, really encouraging to see your advocacy over the last many years. I know Councilwoman Strasser, you spoke a little bit about this, but there was a question from one of the attendees about concerns about the working conditions of railroad personnel. And so I don't know, Justin or Nick, in your work, if you've seen issues related to working conditions that are contributing to some of the challenges, or if there's anything that anyone would like to say more to that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, I think that the question of two-person crews is a good starting point. The rail industry has across the board, and this is I wrote about this recently. There was a horrible rail accident in Greece after East Palestine, the deadliest accident in the history of the country. And it all gets back to corporate cost cutting, and they've cut 75% of their employees. A private firm from Italy bought the rail line and just started slashing costs. Norfolk Southern, I think, has cut over 50% of their employees in the last 10 years. This is a huge issue. We're asking too much of the workers, and they're, the one thing of requiring a two-person crew for these potentially 2-mile-long trains doesn't seem unreasonable, but states have tried to mandate that. Illinois was one, Washington State was another. And during the Trump administration, PHMSA's lawyer made a statement saying that they weren't going to allow states to, they were going to overrule states' authorities here. And I don't have the exact quote, but essentially they said, safety is not a reason to inhibit market growth. So what they were saying was, we don't care if you want to make it safer and protect your residents if someone else can make money. Maybe even someone not, it didn't matter who it was. But that was their attitude during the Trump administration. Like, regulations get in the way of profits. It's a rough time. I've talked to retired rail workers, and rail workers, it's tough. It's a very tough job. We're asking too much of them. They're not getting the health benefits they need. And, you're asking one person to operate a 2-mile long train. These tracks weren't designed for that. These trains are that long because private equity firms want more profits, and they're demanding, that we have longer trains. And so we're asking too much of the workers, and we definitely need our representatives to fight for them. And because it's a huge component of this, we're asking them to operate these large, dangerous trains. And in my work, everyone is using this term bomb trains now, which I do think is accurate and appropriate. But that term was originated with employees who, you can imagine if you're driving one of these trains, it's like, do you really want to drive a train of explosive oil across the country? No, but that's their job. And so we really should be giving them the tools and the support they need to do this safely, to protect them and protect the communities along the rails.
Thank you so much for that. I think so. We have a comment in the chat that I'll share as a comment, and then also pose it as a question. But again, coming from Andrew at Clean Air Council, just sharing that empowering residents to be prepared could also be a helpful strategy for emergency response. And their story is that when Clean Air Council was on the ground with volunteers, they were some of the only people wearing respirators, and even workers who were aerosolizing the stream for decontamination weren't wearing protective equipment. And, people in their neighborhood have semi-routine conversations about how to prepare for industrial disasters and climate change related disasters, because there's a lack of trust with state responders to effectively handle issues, especially in communities that are poor working class. And so I wonder, are there things that we could be doing to better empower residents to be prepared, or to bring the idea of resident response into our emergency preparedness planning?
I can comment on that if no one else wants to. I think that one of the things, and I was actually at a national oil by rail conference in Pittsburgh in 2015, I believe. And one of the people there talked about how emergency response really is a distraction. And we've seen that in East Palestine, right? We have people showing up who are trained, but there's nothing, they couldn't do anything. So the best solution at the time was, they're saying these tank cars filled with vinyl chloride might be overheating. They might explode, which is certainly a real risk. They couldn't do anything to stop that other than to burn, to vent them and burn them off. That was their plan. That doesn't protect the community. We see a lot of public relations about how first responders, they're giving money to first response, but the actual response in one of these accidents is to evacuate, and that includes first responders. It's to clear out. And most often these trains burn for days. That's the response. And so I do think it would be great to educate the community. When I was in Albany, New York, and we were trying to get this information from the oil companies and the rail companies, there were communities who lived right next to the track saying, we want an evacuation. Like, what are we supposed to do? No one told us. And I think that's, what I would do. I live now 2.5 blocks from a rail line. I would run. If I hear a noise, if I see an explosion, leave, because plan to leave for days. Like that's all you can really do in these situations. So I think there really is. I think it's important to raise awareness in the communities along the rails about, you don't go take pictures if you see an explosion. You run and you get your family out of there.
Yeah. And I really want to say thank you to Clean Air Council also for not only all the work you're doing, but for being here and sharing your experience. It's helpful to have that perspective. There was another comment in the chat just kind of reiterating the point about the kind of magnitude of Norfolk Southern's independent decision to go from the plan to vent 1 car to 5 cars. And John here, who is joining us as an attendee, shared that there was some pretty striking testimony from the Director of Emergency Services for Beaver County at a March U.S. Senate committee hearing. And so I'm just going to paste a link to that testimony in the chat for everyone, so that you can see kind of the nature of his remarks and how much of a destabilizing shift it was for all of the emergency responders when that decision was made. So thanks, John, for pointing that out. And hopefully this testimony is helpful for people to review and just get his perspective. We also have a question that I'm not sure, I'll pose this to the panel, and if this is a question we need to kind of get back to folks on, we can do that. But do we know what the projected cost for retrofitting braking systems on US trains would be?
Yeah, I can chat about this. I'm sure you can too. So this kind of goes back, to Justin's comments on the ECP braking system and the changing. The Obama administration really projected this out to be about $660 million, that was their estimate, $664 million. And this cost benefit analysis that had to be done in order to rule make in the federal government's process also then paired that cost against the potential cost of, as a benefit, avoiding the costs of these disasters that would be spared by having the ECP brakes across the train cars. And so one of the things that happened, and this was a very popular media narrative headline right after East Palestine, when we saw kind of a little bit of politicization of the event, was the Trump administration really redid that cost-benefit analysis and actually rolled back the ECP rule on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis that they conducted that was much lower in terms of the projected environmental damage and property damage that would occur from these disasters. So essentially you had Obama-era rulemaking that said, here's what we think it costs to outfit the trains with this brake change over the next several decades. Here's the potential savings in property, environmental, personal damage from prevented disasters because of the brake change. And then you had the Trump administration essentially say, no, we think that cost-benefit analysis is wrong. We've got this other cost-benefit analysis that says that the savings from the disaster prevention are much lower. And then it kind of came back around that their cost-benefit analysis, and the economists at the Department of Transportation and the Trump administration had actually left out the class of disasters that are non-lethal, that are related to the oil carrying on these trains. And so it was low by something like $115 million. And so that's kind of, I think, maybe to the point, Justin, you were making, which is the ways to make rules and get around rules and influence rulemaking, not just through Congress, but through the agencies. These companies like Norfolk Southern are extremely well versed in it. And as soon as that opportunity was there to basically not have this ECP thing unfold the way that it was maybe you and others had hoped for, Justin, really comes down to getting other economists to say something different, which in the world of economics, a lot of modeling, a lot of projections, a lot of assumptions go into that. And so really kind of to the core question, the initial projection was like $660 million over 20 years. I think it was the initial Obama administration cost figure. And Justin, correct me if any part of that was my kind of big 30,000 foot view was a little.
I think it's mostly accurate. I think we should put that in perspective. $660 million is a fraction of what Norfolk Southern has done in stock buybacks, right? And that's for the whole industry. The NSF makes billions every year. This is what the industry does. They use cost-benefit analysis. There have been some changes recently. The Biden administration just made some basic changes to how we look at cost-benefit analysis, which is this, I think, should be discarded as a way to evaluate protecting the public. But what also happened in that case too, initially the industry said, well, you say 500 or 600 million, we say it's going to cost $3 billion and we're not going to do that. The industry is really good at making up numbers, and with they hire people to come up with these numbers to tell us that these modern brakes don't work And I just want to reiterate, we're being asked to believe by the rail industry that no better braking system has been invented since 1860. Now, these ECP brakes, as I've detailed in articles in my book, are used in Australia. They're used in South Africa. And what are they finding? The trains are more efficient. They save on fuel. The people who operate the trains, if you talk to an operator who's used the current brakes versus ECP brakes, everyone is going to want to operate one with the modern brakes. It's a huge advantage. And so, yeah, but we get this cost-benefit analysis and told they can't afford it. They can afford it, clearly, with the profits that they're making and their stock buybacks. They just don't want to. And but they're asking us to believe that, to go against all the research and the facts. Let's just go to Australia. The latest argument from the Association of American Railroads spokesperson was, these brakes don't work. They shut down. The trains get stranded. Really? I mean, has the Australian railroad system shut down? No. So yeah, it's just it's unfortunate.
Yeah, just I wanted to make sure I had the right number, but just last year, it looks like Norfolk Southern bought back about $3.4 billion in stock buybacks. And that 664 number from the Obama administration, you mentioned this just now, but just to clarify, that was industry-wide. So that wasn't just the cost to Norfolk Southern to go change its braking over. That was the Obama administration's projection for the entire rail industry. And then you had a single company buy back $3.4 billion in stock in 2022. So that is great context. Thanks for adding that, Justin.
Thank you. We have a great question from Joe Minot with Clean Air Council that I think is really on everyone's minds, which is, how do we keep this story live long enough so that we keep up the pressure on Congress? And, this is just kind of editorializing a little bit, but also so that we don't, again, end up back in the same place in 10 years, right? So what do you all think about what we could do collectively to keep up the pressure and keep the story live?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's been amazing activism on this, but unfortunately that normally comes in the form of people volunteering their time and their money. There are lots of great organizations like Ohio River Valley, but after in 2014, 2015, Center for Biological Diversity, Earth Justice, a lot of groups were filing lawsuits and trying to get real regulations in place. Unfortunately, that's kind of what we're up against. We have to try to pressure our politicians to do this, but it's really the public is we're on our own to figure out how to protect ourselves from these industries. So there's and this, I think it was a little different with oil trains because they kept exploding after lockdown all across the country and in Canada, and so people everywhere were very concerned. And the story stayed in the news a bit more. One of the issues I think that I was able to, thankfully, the organization I worked for and did all this work was DSMOG. They allowed me to keep writing about this for 5 years. Most major news organizations, after the fires go out and the people have been poisoned, well, what are you going to do? And they stop writing about it. I'm working with some people who are working on a documentary about this. I know, other people are following it, but unfortunately it's going to come to local politicians and local people and groups and people volunteering, but keeping the pressure on because we need to keep the story of what's going on in East Palestine alive, and so people understand, because unfortunately the people in Lac-Mégantic are still living this 10 years later. I mean, their downtown is vacant, and the only thing there is train tracks. So the trains are still running through.
I think one thing, and Councilwoman, I think you mentioned this, and a really important point that you made, was that this is actually a story not just about the rail industry, but about, in the East Palestine case, the plastics industry across the country. And so you have to also kind of, I think, as we tell this story, if it's, oh, there was this train crash because this really specific thing happened, then it's really easy for communities in other places in the country to, as the national headlines fade, the attention on this issue to fade. But the reality is, I mean, the chemicals that were the precursor to PVC, to plastics that derailed and spilled in East Palestine, started outside of Houston, Texas, right? I mean, so it's like a 1,600-mile journey that this train went on before it got to the point where it derailed. And so the really hard part, I think, to communicate is that the train could have derailed. This could have happened at any point along that 1,600-mile journey, right? And it could have impacted communities in Texas or Louisiana or any of the states between Pennsylvania and Texas that these tracks happen to go through, right? And to the point that you made earlier as well, each of these communities would have faced the same problems that East Palestine faced, where the states wouldn't have known what was necessarily on board. The regulatory framework wouldn't have provided an opportunity for emergency responders or for state officials to actually really do anything once this happened. So I think part of it is making sure that we're telling that full story and saying, zooming out and saying, why are these chemicals being shipped around the country? And the answer is the fossil fuel and the plastics industry. And so that's a really important point you made earlier that I want to stress, that as we continue to talking about the dangers of transporting these precursor chemicals when we talk about the plastic industry, which does get a lot of more media attention kind of across the country routinely.
And I'll jump on that point and say that just like any other issue, this one, we need to focus on different messages for different audiences, because that message around breaking our dependence on fossil fuels or plastic is not going to work with some populations who need to be moved on this. I can speak much more to the organizing opportunity around policy than I can the regulatory framework. But when it comes to influencing elected officials, right, it only takes a couple of organic emails to come to someone like me to get my attention on an issue. Now that's going to be different for a member of Congress. And fortunately, my member of Congress and the one just north of me, Representative Lee and Representative DeLuzio, are fully on board, supporting this. But I do think that it's a numbers game, right? It's counting votes and seeing who signed on to these bills in the House and the Senate, and then figuring out where which ones are gettable based on rail districts running through, or railroads running through their district, and just getting a few people organizing in that area, or getting a few people to call and to meet with them and to find out what motivates them on the issue. Because ultimately, the prospect of an explosion, a fire, loss of life, right? Understanding that could be on their hands if it were to come to pass, could be the motivating factor. It could be something else that motivates them. But to me, it comes down to just the good old-fashioned organizing across the country. And because this is an issue that's so multifaceted, it's a big opportunity to talk about multiple issues. Like I mentioned before, urban, rural, it doesn't really matter. Our rail lines are so ubiquitous that you could get the votes pretty easily just by the members of Congress whose districts include a rail line like this.
Yeah, I just like to follow. I think it's a really important point that Nick's made and has been brought up. But if we talk about this term bomb trains that's being used now, a lot of this is tied to the fracking boom. The fracking boom in North Dakota, they didn't have pipelines, so they put this oil in DOT 111 tank cars and shipped it all over the country. When they started exploding, people started asking questions like, hey, what's going on? But there was no thought. It was just, let's get this frack oil to refineries. We have you mentioned near 29 miles from East Palestine is the new Shell cracker plant. That only exists because there's so much fracked natural gas that they want to make plastics with that. And so the plastics right now, we look at the oil industry, we see that, with electric vehicles coming, there's going to be less gasoline consumption, less diesel consumption. The oil industry's backup plan is to make more plastics. That's where there's been huge investment in this country, is building out things like the Shell cracker plant. So as the plastic industry expands, more of these trains will be carrying this stuff. And I want to follow up on a point that was made earlier. The industry does like to say this is the safest way to move these materials. That's fine. It's all relative, but that doesn't mean it's safe. And we clearly can see that the fact that there's been some reference to that Senate hearing that happened, where the CEO of Norfolk Southern was being grilled on those things, and he would not promise to stop stock buybacks and invest in safety. He would not go near the idea of not rewarding his investors. During that hearing, he was informed that another one of Norfolk Southern's trains had derailed. So, it may be the safest way to move these things, but that doesn't mean that the communities along the rails are safe. And that doesn't, I think we need to remember what the NTSB said about East Palestine, 100% preventable. How do we get there? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? We know how to do it. How do we make the industry, how do we enforce it? And that's what we need to answer.
I think that's a great point, and even gets back to Joe's question about how do we keep the story live and the pressure on. It seems like, reinforcing the idea that this is that, there are inevitable disasters, but there are also very preventable situations, and that, we can't just sort of throw our hands up and say it's out of our control. It seems like an important thing for us all to reinforce. We also have a question from Mary Jo Poole asking how can they get more involved? And in this particular instance, this person is in, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, Champaign. And railroads are central there and can hear them from their house. So just any advice about, how people in potentially impacted communities can get more involved and potentially even create a network of railroad impacted communities that are working together to bring awareness and pressure around this issue.
Well, I haven't been as directly involved in in this issue recently, but when I was working, over the 8 years that I followed this as a journalist, there's certainly lots of great activist groups that were working on the oil by rail issue and moving ethanol by rail, and they're still involved in this. So I think finding some of those, Stand.Earth was a kind of one of the lead organizers in a lot of that activism. But I think, trying to reach out and find who's been involved in this, but also then talking to your politics, whoever represents you, and seeing, making them aware of this issue, because I talk to politicians on a somewhat regular basis. They can't know everything, right? If you're representing, there are all sorts of emergencies going on in your district or whoever you're representing, and so part of it is you have to do the work and bring it and educate them about why they need to be involved and why this is one of their top priorities, because they have limited time and resources. I think that, I would advise people not to start from scratch, because there's over a decade of work on this and lots of groups who've done fantastic work. So finding them and who's been working on it in your area. And as I said earlier, unfortunately, what it probably means is if you want to do something in your area, well, you're probably in charge, and you're going to have to start it, and you're going to have to try to organize people. And that's how this has happened across the country. And it was very, very successful. The only thing that has made significant improvements in rail safety in this country have been the activists who have stopped new oil. There were a lot of, there's not much you can do if they're just passing through your town. There are a lot of towns on both the east and west coast, towns and cities, but mostly where there are big ports, because they want to get these hazardous materials to ports so they can ship them around the world. And those communities said no. And they have standing and we're able to say, you're not bringing that stuff into our community. Yeah, the activists have been what's kept more of these dangerous things off the rails. And that's, with the system we're facing right now, that's really what drives this. So I think education and organizing and keeping the pressure on your elected officials.
And I do think there is significant political influence to be had when talking about this kind of thing. I mentioned earlier that you saw local officials and politicians in Michigan and Indiana and Texas really suddenly have strong stances about the contaminated soil from East Palestine coming to their community. These communities have toxic and hazardous waste disposal sites, right? They're not just taking it to their county and dumping it on the ground somewhere in Texas or Indiana, right? They're taking it to a facility. So if hazardous material is coming to that facility all the time, and suddenly this, truck is bringing it from East Palestine, which has been really, high profile in the news, there's a political motivation, right, for some of these folks to come out and say, wait a minute, we don't want toxic soil from East Palestine coming to our community. And so I think we've seen there are kind of opportunities where there is room for political pressure, where people have made decisions. Not that I'm, advocating that nobody should take the toxic soil from East Palestine to a facility, but certainly those communities raised enough concern about it that their local officials and governors or state representatives said, we don't want that in Michigan, or we don't want that in Indiana. So I do think that there's evidence where that kind of advocacy to local officials has actually produced them to speak out on an issue that they may not have otherwise spoken out on.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Justin. There's a comment in the chat just drawing attention to the fact that the Ohio River has just been declared the second most endangered river in the United States. And that is a result of the potential harm from chronic pollution. So everything from forever chemicals to bioactive chemicals to acute events like the disaster in East Palestine. And so, the various efforts that are related to fighting some of those impacts could also help with the effort to kind of keep up the pressure on rail safety policy. So I think that's a great point, and a really good reminder that a lot of railways were built to be co-located with waterways, and that there are, significant threats associated with that to our natural resources.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that. With all of the major oil train accidents, there were 8 or 9 over several years. A river was involved. Tank cars go into rivers, and so as you mentioned, it's just the nature. Due to the favorable topography, trains go along waterways, and it's one of the reasons why we started in Albany, New York, back in 2013 and 2014. These trains went right down the Hudson River, and the Hudson River has a great comeback story about a river that was, contaminated and now is much cleaner. But that's one of the real risks of these. So when people say, well, the rail is safer than these other modes of transport, there is that risk that inevitably, when there's a spill, if there aren't pictures of these tank cars burning in a river, there's risk of contamination.
Absolutely. Well, we're getting close to our time, and I would like to give a very warm thanks to all of our panelists, and really appreciate you being here to share your perspectives and your expertise. And I'm also happy to open the floor for any final comments you might like to make, or parting words that you'd like to leave our audience with.
I guess I will just address the one question that came up about the venting of the 5 cars in East Palestine. I think that's going to be something we're going to hear more about. And I did watch that Senate hearing where we mentioned the testimony. And yes, that first responder said the information they've been given was one of the cars was in danger because of the temperature, that it might explode. And that's certainly a real risk. The other 4 were not. We've since been told, well, they thought the pressure relief valves on those tank cars, 2 of them may not have been, functioning properly. Again, it shows how ill prepared they are if that's the case. But there was nothing about the other 3 that I've seen so far that put them at a risk of an explosion. But as another first responder pointed out, if you vented them all, I believe the quote was, "We nuked a town so we could get a railroad open a few days earlier." That's by venting all those 5 tank cars at the same time, it allows them to get in there and start rebuilding the rails. And that's one of the things that stunned me when I first started doing this work. There would still be tank cars on fire, and they'd have land movers in there rebuilding the trains, the tracks, so that they could keep the trains running. And so I think that issue, the decision, it seems like Norfolk Southern made it based on that testimony in the Senate to vent those 5 tank cars. I think that needs to be continued scrutiny, and I think that's something that we're going to hear more about. And I think the people of East Palestine deserve to know.
I think like a lot of other issues, in terms of keeping this in the forefront of people's minds, like, yes, the sheer shock and awe factor of an explosion, of a terrible event like has occurred in East Palestine can motivate people right in that moment. And I think that the positive messaging around, as Justin pointed out, the possibility of a much safer system like we see in Australia, a braking system, right? Like actually showing people the vision of what is possible is also incredibly motivating, especially for elected officials who are action oriented and want to understand not just the doom and gloom of it and, the serious harms that it can and is causing people in the environment or air quality, water quality. We also want to hear what the possibilities are for a way to make this work, right? I don't think anyone is under the impression that we're going to shut down all rail, cargo rail in this country, right? That's not the solution. What we want to hear are the solutions that are available. So what are those solutions and how can we get there together is the message that I want to, continue to hear from advocates and from activists, and that, I want to keep on beating the drum around as well.
Well, I think that's a great note to close us out on, which is just sort of a call to action to figure out how we can come together with a solutions-oriented platform and work with allies like Councilwoman Strasburger to make some real change so that, again, we're not here having the same conversation 10 years from now. So thank you so much to everyone who joined this evening. Thank you to our panel. We really appreciate you. And many thanks to River Valley Organizing, Clean Air Council, and the other groups on the ground who have been filling in where our, in some cases, where our public agencies have been letting us down. So many thanks to all of you.
Well, that was kind of interesting.
Doesn't happen again. We know how to do it. How do we make the industry? How do we enforce it?
Are you watching it again for it now? Well, that was interesting, kind of. I guess it's more focusing on the railroad industry and stuff to keep this from happening again. But it's like all the senators and stuff that was down here. They're all excited because they introduced that bill. The bills they make railroads safer, but it still doesn't help. Doesn't do anything to help people in East Palestine. But it makes them feel like they're doing something, and they haven't been back since then, not as I know of. Trump came once to give us water, and that's it. So, I don't know. Yeah, I think we got EPA tomorrow. I don't even know where I have it at. Hey, here's our spring fling with bingo. Yeah, Hookstown Legion. Show begins at 7. Oh, look, you even get meet and greet. Yeah, the Ohio River is like really, really dirty because a lot of stuff flows into it. There's a lot of factories beside it, and a lot of stuff are flowing into it. Oh, she's doing okay. She had to get some steroid cream for her hands. She was having a problem with her hands, cracking and then rash. So they gave her some kind of steroid cream to try now, and I guess we'll see if that works or not. But we're all just still hanging out in the toxic wasteland. Oh, so here goes my dog. As soon as I get on here, they're like, okay, let's misbehave. Because he's not paying attention. Her throat's not quite so bad now. She gets a sore throat sometimes when she goes outside, but it's not as bad now since they quit that aeration. That seemed to have toned a lot of it down, which I think was a lot of the problem because they were just putting that them chemicals back in the air again. So since they quit the aeration, it hasn't been too bad with her throat and lungs. But who knows when they're going to start that back up again. They have it there just in case of emergency, and just in case there are million gallon, big blue tanks they put up in case one of them spring a leak. That's why they're keeping equipment there. Yeah, they kind of been changing their stories and stuff. Even that thing I posted today with Shaw in front of the Ohio committee. Man, some stuff he says it just makes you mad. I'm not a violent person that much, but man, I should do a little bit of a thing on there, because first thing he brings up is always how much money he spent to clean this up. But if you break down the money, none of the money went to what it was supposed to. Should have gone to. Why is my camera freaking out? Well, I guess from what article I read, that the states that said that they wouldn't take it, the EPA came in and had to order them to take it. So I have no idea where this dirt's going now. I haven't seen anything, they haven't wrote anything. So, yeah, they ordered this under the Superfund Act for them to, if they didn't do it, they were violating the Superfund Act, and so they, ordered them to take it. At least that's what the article said. EPA is kind of changing its tone too about the railroad track laying tracks back over the contaminated soil before they dug it up. That wasn't a big deal before, but now all of a sudden it's a big deal. I noticed Deborah Shore, she brought that up in her last interview that she didn't think that was right. That was in the second assault on East Palestine is the way she put it. So EPA, the federal EPA is kind of changing its tone a little bit. I think they realized their first thing wasn't working, so now they got to try to change it and do something else. So I don't know where that's going to go. We'll see how the EPA thing goes tomorrow. They're supposed to have a few of them. I don't know how many dispatch sessions they're supposed to have, but they're supposed to have a few sessions in order to be transparent in what they're doing. But, I don't believe it. I'll believe the independent testers, which we haven't had anything released for a while. I'll have to get an Andrew and see if he has any other new info released. Because he hasn't released anything for a while, so. But the good thing is we got over 20 universities now coming in and doing independent testings. So a lot of them are doing farmland to tell the farmers if it's okay to plant this season. So we got up to 20 universities now, taking their grant money to cover this because the government won't, the government says they cover it, but I don't think they cover it truthfully. But, they say they do. So, other than that, not really much changed around here. Maybe I'll go out and about tomorrow. I guess they had trains running on another track today, I guess. I didn't go and see, but they had both tracks running today from what I read in the news article this morning. So, there they go with both tracks going again, get the cargo moving before they have to tear the other one up. Maybe I'll go out tomorrow and grab some footage. I haven't seen my road closed people for a long time. They're probably missing me. Well, EPA supposedly taking soil tests in limited farms because they just think this, whole toxic plume stayed in this little area. Plants would take up the dioxin. That's what the farmers are afraid of. And the EPA won't even test people's wells that are like 2 miles away because they just think everything stayed in this whole 1 mile bubble and it didn't go nowhere. I just don't get it. So these universities are coming in. In the model they've shown was only for one tanker. It wasn't 4 or 5. So I haven't even seen a model for the 5 tankers they did. So, I still don't get how they can say, we're going to do 1 tanker. Okay, Sunday night we're doing 1, and all of a sudden Monday you come in and they're saying, oh, we're doing 5. I don't understand how the EPA, or anybody can even let that happen, because they're like, oh, we had no say-so in it. So they want to blow up 5 things and you don't have no say-so in it. I just don't see it. Something fishy with that, but we're slowly learning who was in an incident command, but they're still putting most of the blame on the fire chief, which I think is ridiculous. but he hasn't came out with no statements, which leads me to think maybe a agreement was signed in there that he wasn't allowed to talk about anything that was discussed in that meeting. I'm thinking there's some kind of agreement signed, and that's why everybody's hush about it, because they can't talk about what went on in that meeting. So yeah, with the other chemicals drained, I mean, the train was just full of, and you can't even go off of. I don't think I have that downloaded offhand. I don't think I do. It's somewhere. I mean, you can't even go off of what the list that they gave you, the EPA release, because I don't even trust that list. Because, I mean, a lot of the tankers, they have listed on their, contents remaining unknown, and, and we haven't got nothing after that when they, after they blew the stuff up. They never released anything out that, like, how much did they recover from this tanker, and none of that was released. I think they drained it all. They drained them all. I have the original one that they released. I don't know where I have it at. I'm checking my computer somewhere. I know I have it downloaded somewhere, but they've never released a list after that, like stating what they oh, that's not it. I did it. I don't know where I have it at. I don't think it's this. Why is this opening in Microsoft Edge? Yeah, I have it somewhere. I don't know where I have it at. I'm gonna be releasing that video of all the tanker cars that I was able to label. I've watched so many drone footage and looked at so many pictures, and because a lot of them tankers, you can read the numbers on the side of the car, so you know what was that's what them tankers were. I can pull up the one picture. There goes my dogs again. This is the EPA's picture. I mean, rotate it so you can. This is what was released in the EPA's thing. They show the five vinyl chloride cars together. That's wrong. This one right here with the black mark, this goes to a hopper, I do believe. I don't have it in front of me. I don't know what this one goes to too. I marked off the ones that were wrong in there. So this is a report, and you would think that they would do their best to, being it is a report, but it looks like they just threw it together. Okay, this big old fire mess right here. This is where 4 of your vinyl chloride cars were. Now that'll be what you got vinyl chloride here, you got one here, you got one here, and you got one here. So in this fire, you had at least one. In the plus the other chemicals that was in it. At least I don't have the list pulled up. I'll do it, but I mean this one's right here is clearly venting. You can see it coming out. This would have been the next day because everything was still ice. It was cold as crap that night. I know that. It's like 9 degrees out there. Most of the motor oil was lost. That's what's burning in the center, I do believe. Those said they don't take in the effect of the 3 days this stuff was just continuously burning. They're all focused on, like, we have this should be vinyl chloride right here. These are the benzene tankers right here. One of these boxcars had frozen vegetables in. One had steel in. I mean, you can clearly see this car is venting clearly. I mean, and then you get the PVC pellets burning over here. I think this is the only vinyl chloride tanker they blew up. Was this one right here? Either that one or this one, but I'm guessing this one. This one looks damaged already. This one obviously is damaged. This stuff's going everywhere. It's just... And the funny thing was, the fire was out, too. Well, this is the same thing. This is the same thing. Okay, see, the fire eventually went out. And then it flared back up again. This just shows all the same stuff, I think, again. Yeah. So, I don't know. I'll release that video. And it will kind of lay you out the at least the cars I could identify, verify for real. Some of the other ones I just had to guess by way the train would power up as it derailed. I just find it very funny. They say, well, now they're saying, the article I read the other night, they're saying car number 3 and 38 also had an overheated wheel bearing, was the latest. When they started, car number 23 had the overheated wheel bearing, but car number 23 and number 24 isn't even in that picture. It's still connected to the train that's stopped on down the tracks. The cars don't start piling up until they hit 25 and 26. That's your 2 hoppers of vinyl, PVC, your pellets. So if car 23 was the one with the hot axle and caused the derailment, well, they must still be connected to the train on down on tracks because it's not in the pile. So, but now we're saying car number 3 and 38 also had a hot axle. So, I don't know. We'll never know what's going on. But all right, guys, I'm gonna get out of here. I need to run to the store before they close. I need some Monster. I'll go out and about tomorrow. See, I don't know. I've watched so many videos about this was planned. They planned this. I don't think it was planned. It just was a freak accident. I do believe they planned the explosion just to get the railroad open faster, is my personal opinion, because, like I said, they didn't empty nothing out of none of them cars. They dumped every one of them cars so they could get the railroad open faster. But, it's hard to say. We live in a weird society. My camera's like going crazy. I would hate to say that the government wouldn't do that, but I've seen worse stuff from the government lately. So, it's hard to tell. I don't know. I guess time will tell, but we'll slowly get it figured out. We'll slowly get the story out there. Like I said, mainstream media is pretty much gone. They show up on the big stuff. That's it. So it's only us little guys now running around town. Thank God we have Rick. He is a very, very big proponent, and he knows a lot of he knows a lot of really big people to keep this out there. So I'm glad he's on board too. So yeah, I see Maine had that, but what they say, there was nothing hazardous or something. They said there's something about, isn't that the one where the ice washed the tracks out or something? Or maybe that was another one. There's been so many. It's just, I know we have a lot, and every year, and maybe East Palestine's maybe bringing, more light to it, but it's, there's a difference between just a train derailment and a, hazardous train derailment. And it just seemed, even that, what river was that in? That barge that was stuck against the dam? They had that one barge that was stuck there, and they said, oh, it's not leaking chemicals in there, in the river, and, there's just so much weird stuff, but you gotta think about it. In the end, he who controls the water controls the people, because if there's no clean water, and, we can't live without water, so you kind of think, is that the end goal? Make all the water pretty much so you can't use it, and then you have to get it from, certain people. I don't know. Could be not. But they've been doing some weird stuff anyways lately, so. So they lie all the time, just like this whole the Indiana plastic fire they had. God damn, man. They've asbestos flying in people's yards, and they're finding flakes of this stuff in their yard, and they're telling you not to mow your grass because it's going to blow it everywhere. Well, this stuff had to go in water, and all these chemicals had to go in water from this plastic burning. I'm sure, Mark from the EPA, he seems to be the big guy they send up to all this, because he was in Flint, Michigan, too. So I'm sure he was out there telling them everything was okay. EPA would take care of it like he's been telling us. So I'll ask him about it tomorrow, because he's supposed to be doing a presentation. So I'll ask him if he was in Indiana. I guarantee it was. But, this stuff goes somewhere. It just doesn't disappear. They want us to make it think it disappears. Well, it don't. So, I don't know. I guess it could be a conspiracy theory road you go down, but, and there's factory fires all the time, but with the way the, country's going and everything, so, I don't know. I hate to go down the conspiracy road a lot, but, some stuff you just can't avoid. And the simple thing is, like I said, if you have no water, you're going to bow to whoever has water. Same thing with food. You might make it, 3 days without food, and then eventually you're just going to go nuts and do whatever you can to get food to feed your family or yourself. So this country could start to get crazy with all these restrictions they're putting in place now. So I don't know. But we're still alive. We'll look at it in the positive event. We're still alive. So, all right, guys, I'm going to get off here. Like I said, I need to run to the store here before they close. But I'll go out tomorrow and get some footage. We'll see what's going on in town. Oh, you can go 1 month without food. I don't know if I would last 1 month without food. Holy cow. Oh, no problem, Thirsty. Thank you for watching and giving your advice and stuff. It's great. I really do appreciate it. I just try to keep on getting this out there as much as I can. Just keep on making people mad. That's all I do, but that's all right. A lot of people love me in town. A lot of people hate me in town, so that's okay. All right, Thirsty. I am going to get off here. I need to make it to the store, and I think they close at 9. It's 8:30. I better get going. So, I'll catch up with you tomorrow. 6 o'clock is the start time for that other one. Like I said, I'll be there in person, live streaming that. And I said, then I'll go and get footage during the day. We'll see what changed. We'll see if I can make friends with the road closed people and stuff. I haven't been down there for a while, so let's go make some friends. It's supposed to be nice tomorrow. So, all right. I'll catch you guys later.